Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode. Today, we'll be tackling a common myth in college admissions. So, the idea that students need to quote unquote do it all when it comes to extracurriculars. I'm excited to dive into how students can focus on a few impactful activities that truly align with their passions without stretching themselves too thin. Joining me today is Emily, and together we'll break down the strategies for building a strong extracurricular profile that stands out to admissions officers. So, before we dive in, Emily, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. Can you share a little bit about yourself, your background, and your role at InGenius Prep?
Sure. My name is Emily Parliament, and I'm a former admission officer at InGenius. We also call FAO, that's for former admission officer. I worked for George Washington University and American University in DC after I graduated from Kenyon College. And I got to know the admission world there, got to see how selective universities evaluate applicants and what they're looking for. I was an English major in college, so I love reading and writing, helping students with things like activity lists, resumes, essays, and so on. I worked in admission for about 5 years after college and really enjoyed that, but I wanted to get to know students better and build more of a relationship with them. So I moved over to the college counseling side of things. And that's actually pretty common for folks who work in the admission world to go into college counseling. So I've been a college counselor for about 10 years now. First, I worked in high schools and was the college counselor at a few different schools in DC, California, and Ohio. But now I'm working with InGenius and have really been enjoying that because I get to work with students all over the world and it's not limited by location, which is really incredible. But I do still read applications, which has been really helpful to my work as a counselor. I just finished my 4th season reading applications for Northeastern University in Boston. And I also read MBA applications for Georgetown University in DC. So it's been great to still get to see how these selective universities are evaluating applications, and I can share those insights with my students.
Yeah, that's impressive. I think you've been in the admissions landscape for a while now.
It's gone quickly.
Yeah, it's been like 10 years, right? You said?
As a college counselor.
So I think today is going to be a very interesting one because this is a topic that comes up all the time because both parents and students worry about whether they're doing too much or too little. I've even had students send me a message on Instagram asking if their extracurriculars are too boring. So it's actually a real concern. Let's start by addressing the big myth in college admissions, the idea that students need to join every club or play multiple sports or just do a little bit of everything just to impress colleges. Where do you think the pressure comes from?
As the college admission world gets more and more competitive, more selective, it seems like every year, students are trying to figure out what do I need to do to stand out from all these other students who are applying. And I think it's actually a vicious cycle in that students get anxious, so they think they should apply to more schools to increase their chances of getting in, but that's not actually how things work. And application numbers continue to rise. The number of students competing for this small amount of spots increases, and it gets even harder for admission officers to differentiate students from one another and to select students who are going to make up a diverse class. And what I mentioned just now about a diverse class, I think that's actually really important for families and students to understand. That's something that colleges are aiming for when they are choosing applicants. They're looking not for a bunch of students who are all great at a bunch of things, but maybe they have a need to have a tuba player in the orchestra that year because last year's tuba player graduated, or maybe they need more students for a particular new major that the university is trying to expand. There are all of these little institutional needs, we call them, that colleges have that they are trying to fill certain areas. They're looking for students who fit in different buckets, so to speak. So it's not that they're looking for students who are all great at a sport, the star in the plays at school, that have won Best Delegate in Model UN year after year. They're looking for students who specialize in perhaps one or two things, but that all together are going to create a great class of students.
I like that you mentioned about students being very anxious in this very competitive landscape. And they kind of throw the quality over quantity mantra out of the window because they're comparing themselves to peers. Sometimes they're confused about what does quality over quantity actually mean. So how can focusing on one or two activities have a bigger impact than spreading themselves too thin?
When students are applying to colleges, they'll have an activities list and an honors list in the application. If you're familiar with the common application system, which most students use to apply to almost all of their colleges in most cases, there are spaces for up to 10 activities. And those activities could be anything outside of school classes, anything that students are doing in terms of academic enrichment, like pre-college programs or Coursera courses that they're doing on their own. Could be part-time jobs or internships, shadowing experiences, volunteer work, community work, peer tutoring, school clubs and organizations. Sometimes there are even things that count as activities that students don't realize count, like caring for a sick grandmother. Perhaps they're having to go home every day after school to spend several hours caring for that grandparent, or things like babysitting that would also be considered valid for that activity list. But in filling that list, it's not important that you just have 10 things to fill all those spaces. The admission officers are going to be looking at what have you actually done in those activities? Because it's not valuable just in itself to list something, to say, yes, I'm a member of Model UN and the debate team and the swim team, and I was in 3 different performances in school. You need to be able to back up what you're doing to show evidence of how you've made an impact, why that activity has been important to you, how your dedication to that organization has helped the club or the team, perhaps, and how you've shown leadership or the ability to be a great team member. There's a very short amount of space that you'll have in that activity list to describe what you've done. But it's really important to think about what are those takeaways that you have. What are you able to demonstrate to the admission officers about what you've gotten out of those activities, both how those activities have made you a better person and in turn a better college applicant, but also how you have helped that club, that activity, that team be better. So it's a two-way street.
So is it safe to say that college admissions officers don't actually look for a specific set of extracurriculars? There's no one type of activity that stands out to the college admissions officers, right?
That's exactly right. So let's say we have a student who is interested in engineering and who also enjoys art. Perhaps that student has some robotics recognitions on his resume or activity list. Perhaps she has some coding experience, or she's helped volunteer helping teach coding to younger students in the community. And perhaps that student also, since he's interested in art, also has talked about an exhibit at school that he was able to contribute to that was focused on the intersection of technology and art. Those are the kinds of things that a student who has those interests would probably have, or something related to those different activities. That's probably typical of what a student with those interests would have on their resume or their activity list. But there is definitely no formula. There's no right thing or wrong thing to have. The important thing to think about is, does my profile, the activity list I'm showing, does it make sense with what my interests are? So if you are a student who's interested in engineering and art, for example, the activity list reflect that. So that means you don't need to be a captain of a team and the president of student council, for example. You need to have things that are intentional and that you are being thoughtful about in terms of where you're spending your time. And that could also mean that the things you started doing in 9th grade, perhaps you don't continue with all of those throughout high school. Most students get a better idea of what in particular they want to focus in as they get closer to high school graduation. And perhaps that means that they joined the badminton team in ninth grade. They weren't great at it and they found it didn't really add a lot to them personally. So it's okay if they drop badminton. That allows more time for other things that are more relevant to their interests. So, although there's not a list of things that every student should have, and while it's true that it should be relevant to your interests for sure, it is generally important to show that you have found ways to demonstrate academic rigor and interest outside the classroom through ways such as a pre-college program, a research project or paper, something like that shows you are seeking out things related to your academic interest outside of school. It is important to show leadership skills. And that doesn't mean you have to be the president or the captain or the person in charge. We realize that not everybody can or should be the person in charge, but think about ways that you are adding value and showing leadership skills. That could be perhaps on the soccer team. Maybe you are the person who's helping the younger students, the students who are newer to soccer, learn the basics of the sport. Perhaps you are really good at fundraising, and so you organize some fundraisers for the team to help them raise money for new supplies, new equipment, new uniforms. Those are all ways of showing leadership. And the third thing after academic codification and leadership is community involvement and impact. And that should also be an intentional thing that is hopefully related to your academic interest or an extracurricular interest. But consistency is really key. So if you have, let's say, mentor experience that you're doing with Big Brothers, Big Sisters, maybe you've started that in 10th grade and you're continuing with that throughout 11th and 12th grade as well. That's great. That shows consistency. You were probably able to build some long-term relationships and have a real impact on someone else's life. So those are some key things to consider.
I really like that you covered everything from leadership to passion and consistency.
Right.
Some students worry that if they're not doing something prestigious, for example, like research or a well-known national competition, their extracurriculars won't be strong enough. What would you say to them?
Admission officers understand that all students are coming from a different background, a different context. So they're looking to see how you are performing and the things you are doing within your specific context. For example, if you're coming from a family that has, let's say, the financial means to do a pre-college program, to undertake a project where perhaps you need to travel to it, and that requires getting a plane ticket, for example, then it makes sense that you should seek out activities like that. I have a student, for example, who lives in Australia, and the 16-hour time difference with many of the US universities means that he's probably not going to be able to do a traditional US pre-college program because of the time difference, because of the differences in the school year. Rather than worrying about that and saying, oh no, I can't do a pre-college program, we're just going to find other ways for that student to demonstrate academic interests outside of the classroom instead. We really do have students all over the world, which is amazing. I have students all the way from Australia and Asia and Europe, all the way over to the West Coast of the United States.
In terms of finding the right activities, I think not every student wakes up one day knowing what their passion is, and that's totally okay. And at InGenius Prep, we talk a lot about interest exploration, but where should students even start figuring out what excites them? I know many may feel pressure to choose one activity that perfectly aligns with their future career, but what if they have so many different interests? How can they really show commitment and growth in something they genuinely love, even though it's not directly tied to what major they pursue as a career in the future?
First, as you said, it's totally okay if you are a student who's perhaps in ninth grade, 10th grade, and you don't know what you want to do yet in terms of what major you want to go into. It's totally okay. And although most students have an intended major that they list on their college applications, it usually does not mean that you are tied to that major. It means that, yes, the college is admitting you based on the thought that you're probably going to specialize in that particular area. But a lot of students actually change their major multiple times once they get to college, because they now have the chance to take classes in different areas that perhaps weren't even offered at their high school. Some examples would be sociology, anthropology, political science, philosophy. Those are areas that many high schools just are not able to offer due to limited resources. And now that students have gotten to college and they can try those different areas, maybe they realize they have a new interest area that they want to do instead. So all that to say, totally fine if you're not sure yet what you want to do. And for those students who aren't sure yet, doing some research interest exploration to get to know what are those different areas out there can be really valuable. And that could be through a college-sponsored program. It could be just something like going on the Coursera website. Coursera is a great site that offers free online courses that are sponsored by different universities. Those are things that you can just dabble and see, okay, what's this one about? Roman architecture. I want to learn more about that. Or if you want to know more about Greek mythology, there's a course for that. Those are also things that you can list on your future college applications to say that you did spend time taking these online courses and increasing your knowledge in those areas. Usually it does make sense that when you get closer to 11th grade, 12th grade, you do start to have things that mesh more with a general area of interest in terms of academics. But the thing that's important is that everything generally makes sense with your intended major. For example, if you list biology as an intended major, but almost all of your activities are arts-based, performance-based, and more humanities-oriented, it's probably going to be a little confusing for the admission officer as they're wondering, if she's interested in biology, why doesn't she have any experience in something biology related? And it doesn't have to be a prestigious research experience. It could be something independent that you're pursuing on your own. So don't worry if you don't have the resources to go for one of those prestigious kinds of things, but the narrative needs to make sense. So at InGenius, we have this phrase we use, application persona, and it means, what is the theme of a student's application? What is the way they're presenting themselves in their application? So perhaps that means my student is an aspiring psychologist who's passionate about mental health and wants to advocate for ending the stigma around mental health issues. That would be an example of an application persona. And so for that student, I would expect to see some things related to mental health awareness, counseling, perhaps online peer listening in a volunteer opportunity, a company called 7 Cups. That would be an option. And perhaps they make a blog of their own where they're putting together mental health resources for high schoolers. So everything just needs to make sense together and follow your narrative, whatever that's going to be.
Yeah, I like that you talked about the application persona, because I know we talk a lot about that when it comes to InGenius prep. When it comes to strategy, how should students think about their extracurriculars over the course of their high school years? Is there a smart way to plan and build out on their activities year by year?
I think it's a great idea to have a plan to come up with a general framework for your 4-year experience in high school. But that doesn't mean that things are set in stone, because as you go, you might discover new interests, or your interest level in a certain thing might change, and that's totally fine. So it's good to have a framework, but be willing to have some give in each area. it would be sensible that in ninth grade, when you're just starting off in high school, you're at the member level in your clubs and organizations. You're trying new things, you're joining a few different clubs or activities to see what they're all about, to see if this is something you want to continue doing later on. Maybe you're trying 3 different sports that year, and by the end of the year, I mentioned badminton before, maybe you decide that's not really for you, so you decide to drop that. So the thing that the admission officers are going to want to see is that you're not necessarily just adding new things year after year and you have this one year and this another year, but that probably you started off with a number of things and over time you're building your dedication in a few of those areas, but not trying to pursue a leadership role or long-term impactful dedication in every single area. Because if you're trying to be the number one student in every single area, you're going to spread yourself too thin and you're not going to be able to be excellent at any one of those. So you need to be thoughtful about which ones you're going to put more dedication toward over time and choose to pursue leadership and aim for that idea of perhaps running for vice president, running for president, going for captain as you're progressing through high school.
Now, I want to talk about passion projects next. I know some students are not really familiar or they don't really have any ideas of doing any passion projects. How can students create something meaningful on their own? And how do they highlight that in their applications?
I think it's different for every student, certainly. And we don't expect that every student is going to get to a level where they are making a nationally recognized nonprofit, for example, but focusing on something that's going to be impactful in your community is, I think, a great place to start. I'm thinking of one of my past students who was really passionate about coding, and she wanted to help students in underserved communities get access to coding lessons and learning more about coding in general, because that's not something that's really offered at the elementary school level in her area. So she started a nonprofit organization where she was finding other high school students who were experienced with coding and wanted to help underserved students learn to code. And she really put a lot of time and energy into that project. And she talked with local organizations, local business folks. She took out an ad in a local paper to try to attract other interested instructors, volunteer instructors. And that was something that was really impactful in her community. It's not a national organization, but it's something that in her region, she was able to show that she built up a lot of support behind that. So that's something to keep in mind, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a new club or a new venture. It could also be something like I mentioned earlier, where perhaps you start a blog where you are offering resources, interviewing students on a certain topic to just get awareness out there. Maybe that also means creating a social media account on a few different platforms so that you are gaining more followers, you're getting that word out there for that message you're hoping to spread. But if you're stuck on what to do, I think a great place to start is looking at, okay, what's going on at your school? Does your school have a need for, let's say, a club in your area of interest? Thinking about business, for example. Maybe you are an interested aspiring business student and you want to be able to talk and discuss business related ideas, finance, investing with other students, but your school does not have a business club. That might be a gap that you can fill by starting a club in your school. And I know a lot of students, they might think, oh, just starting a club, that's not that interesting, that's not that unique. But from an admission officer point of view, it is actually quite valuable because it's really showing initiative. It's showing that you took that opportunity, you showed the effort to identify a need and fill that gap. There's a lot that's involved in starting a club and making it successful and getting enough members and holding on to them and making sure that you're having regular meetings and being consistent and hopefully growing your membership over time. So there are a lot of valuable skills that come with starting a club. I think that really speaks to that idea we talked about earlier of it's not so much what you're doing, but can you back it up? Can you show how it's been important to you, what your takeaways have been, and why it's been impactful?
I know you've been in the admission space for a long time, and also you've worked with so many students over the years and read thousands of common applications, I'm pretty sure. Do you remember any cool stories about your passion projects that really made an impact that you've read, or maybe something unique or unexpected that got your attention as an admissions officer back then?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a student who it's an international student, so somebody who wasn't living in the US already, but he was very interested in discussing immigrant issues for immigrants who were coming to his country from other countries. And he'd noticed this initially because of a need in his own community that he was hearing in his church group that there was a need for families who could help these newly arrived immigrant families, help them get adjusted to the area. He felt there just wasn't a lot of awareness that there is this population that does have these needs. He wanted to be able to let more people in the area know, hey, we have these folks who are arriving who want to be part of our community and they need help and they need assistance. And he decided to start an Immigrant Voices project where he was interviewing members of the immigrant community of all ages, really, and all throughout the country, starting in his region and then expanding to a wider location region. He made a great website to showcase these stories and was able to get some recognition from local press and newspapers. And in doing so, he was able to raise money that would benefit these immigrant families and also recruit more families from that country who were able to offer their assistance to the newly arrived immigrant families. So that's an example of something that really stood out to me because it showed that this student was looking at a problem, or not problem, but something that needed more attention in his community, something that needed more awareness. And he started something to bring awareness to it. And he was able to show how he had that real impact on people in his community. I think those are some key ideas for students to think about.
Yeah, I think that's really inspirational. I hope that students or parents listening would just really reflect and think about maybe some of the issues that are happening around them and they could take some inspiration from that. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really
Yeah.
cool.
Mhm.
When it comes to describing each activity in the Common App, I think it only gives students 150 characters,
Mhm.
right? I think that's like barely enough for a tweet. But what are like the key elements of a strong extracurricular description, and what are some of the common mistakes students should avoid?
Yes, it is really a challenge just to use that space, that small space, as efficiently as possible. There are so many places where, as an English major who loves editing, I can help students with abbreviations and just being more concise and making sure that space is used to the best of its ability. So there's the position first. That would be, for example, member, grade 9, secretary, grade 10, vice president, grade 11, president, grade 12. That would show positions that student had in, let's say, that example of a club. Then there's organization name. That would be, for example, student council at Smithfield High School, just telling us where that organization is. If it is a lesser known organization that the general public might not be familiar with, that's also a good place where you can add a little bit of context to say, oh, this is a nonprofit that aims to blah, blah, blah. And then you can explain the mission of the organization. Then there's that description field, which is only 150 characters. And that's where you need to put that information about what impact you had, how did your involvement make the club or the organization better, how did you show leadership? This is a great place to use quantitative pieces like fundraised $3,000 in a 2-week period to benefit this population. Or things like grew membership from 10 in the first year to 30 in the second year. that's another thing where you're showing with numbers the positive impact you had on the club. Or it could be, to go with one of the examples I used earlier, if you were talking about the soccer team, you could talk about how you helped orient 4 new freshman members to the team and teach them foundational soccer skills. That's showing teaching, helping. Those are great skills to be able to show. This is not somewhere to rehash basic information. So if, for example, the activity you're talking about is soccer, for the description field, this is somewhere to get specific about your unique contribution in that area. A good way to think about it is if your teacher, let's say, had access to your activity list with all the things you're doing, would they be able to read that description in your activities and know that this is your activity list? So it should be personalized and unique to you. It should not be general or just basic.
Yeah, that's a good one. So, Emily, as a former admissions officer at InGenius Prep, you've worked with, like you mentioned, hundreds of students around the world, helping them discover their interests, building strong resumes, and really stand out in the competitive landscape. I'd like to dive deeper into your personal experiences working with our InGenius Prep students. Can you share any stories of students you've guided in improving their extracurricular activities? Maybe an example of someone who started with a scattered resume and then was able to refine it into something truly compelling.
I'm thinking of a student I started working with when she was in 9th grade. And I think it was actually a great thing about her that she had so many different interests, because it really showed her curiosity. When we first started working together and I showed her a list of majors at a random university, she was fascinated by the idea of so many of them. And she said, "Oh, biology, that sounds cool, but also public policy. I want to learn about that. And what is public health? I want to learn about that." And so she was so interested in delving into these different areas. One of the things we did to help her learn more about different directions to see which one she might want to hone in on, she did a research interest exploration program that we have through InGenius to do this kind of thing on their own, where they're exploring different areas, different academic topics. I think a great place to start is what the student and I did, where I said, okay, I want you to get a newspaper, and it could be just online as well. And I want you to read that newspaper every day and look at all the different sections that are offered there in terms of business and style and the book section, all the different things, and list 5 articles that captured your interest every day, just based on the headline and based on a little bit that you read about them. And then we analyzed that list together to see what are the common things that are coming out here. And what we gathered was that she was really fascinated by animal behavior and stories about, oh, did you know that spiders do this? And that this spider is the biggest one in the world, for example. And here are things they do when they're trying to catch prey. And so together we decided to explore animal behavior more. That also went into a little bit of studying human psychology, cognitive science. She eventually got a shadowing experience with a veterinarian's office to get to be around animals some more. She became a volunteer at her local zoo. That didn't mean that she necessarily got to be hanging out in the elephant enclosure with the elephants, but she was getting to engage with visitors to the zoo and share interesting facts about animal behavior with them, and share information about species and animals that they might not have known about otherwise. So she explored her academic interests, she got involved in the community, and she also decided to volunteer at a local botanic garden. And that's not necessarily related to animals, but it's certainly related to living things, plant life, and it's just something that she really enjoyed. And that was really valuable to show that long-term involvement over time. Eventually, she did a research project relating to animal behavior, in particular spiders, and she was able to get that published in a journal for high school research work, which was really amazing. Eventually, in that finished activities list, there was a clear narrative to show this is a student who's really passionate about science and animal behavior, and here's how she translated that into her activities.
Yeah, I find the whole process from the beginning to the end so fascinating because it's reading the newspaper and then
Mhm.
picking out different articles that interest her. I think it's a really good process for students to find out what they're interested in. So before we wrap up, Emily, what's that one piece of advice you'd give to students who are looking to improve their extracurriculars but might feel overwhelmed by trying to do it all? What's a practical step they can take today to start making a real impact as they finish out their high school years?
I'm thinking of one of my students who was a member of, let's say, 10 different things, and he just didn't know how to pare down and decide which things he really wanted to focus in. And he had things that were business related, but also coding related. And then he was doing all these other things and also volunteering at a botanic garden, for example. We really prioritized together to say, okay, what are the places you can see yourself, let's say, pursuing a leadership position in the future? Because that's probably a good place to focus your time. Because if you can increase your involvement, increase your personal impact in that area, that's going to be a good thing. So we prioritized, we talked about, all right, let's say chess, even if this doesn't have anything to do with your future major. If this is something you really enjoy, then you should keep that, because admission officers are able to hear that passion in the way you talk about your activities, both in your application, but also in admission interviews, in emails you might send to the admission office about your interest in their school and what you want to bring to their community. So prioritizing your time is going to be really important. Understanding that you can't do everything, and that's okay. But what are the things that are really important to you, and what are the things you can see yourself expanding and sticking with over time?
I really enjoyed today's conversation because you shared a lot of like personal anecdotes and stories and how you help students from beginning to end and how to build a really impactful extracurricular activities list. So thank you, Emily, for being on our podcast today. I would love to have you back.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure to share ideas with students and families. I know it can be a really overwhelming process, the college admission world. And as a counselor, I'm always eager to help make families feel a little more at ease.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.